Okay, well, welcome to the Art of Consistency. This is the second module in everything you ever wanted to know about data but are afraid to ask, maybe. And today we'll be talking really about methods. And today is about sort of helping educators of all kinds in special education be aware of some of the issues that come into play when we're both assessing students, whatever the let's say IEP objective or goal is, or we're instructing. So this is about developing consistent, reliable methodologies and thinking about issues that come into play when we're collecting data and ultimately going to use data. So I want to start today thinking about the mechanics of methods, and I want to draw on an analogy, and that is to help us think that good methods, when they're spelled out coherently, intelligently, and helpfully, most importantly, they read like how-to manuals. They're really just to tell people what to do, step by step, and really eliminate questions of potential variability in the ways in which people either assess or instruct. So let me give you kind of an analogy with car mechanics. Let's say that I tell you, look, your car's got a bad battery. Just go replace the battery. And that's all I tell you. Now, if you have no clue about cars and car mechanics, you might not have any idea of what to do. What kind of battery should I get, and where does it sit, and how do I attach the wires? So there are a variety of things that would come into play in terms of replacing the battery that are all really methods questions. They're kind of how to do it, and it's what is it? What's the object, and what's the right voltage, and what are these cords, and where does the red and the black go, and all those kind of things. So I need to describe that in detail. Needless to say, when it gets more complicated, like replacing the transmission. I mean, now we're talking about a really complex device, and if I'm not a car mechanic, just trying to figure out, what is the transmission, and what are the pieces, and where do they go, and where do the cables go, and what's the wiring, and what's the voltage, and how do I check it? Right? I really need a manual that describes how to do it. Okay, so a good manual for car repair would really lay out with diagrams, visuals, and step by step of what to do in what order and so forth. And basically the analogy here is that's how methods should be written for assessment and for instruction in special education. So what I want to just talk about briefly here as an introduction to the topic here is just a little bit about the how-tos for assessment and instruction irrespective of the area of education. So let's take an example where maybe we've got a objective in ELA which has to do with writing, or it's an objective, let's say, that has to do with working on single-digit addition in mathematics. Okay, so let's try that. So let's say that I've got an objective which says that Sarah will be able to accurately carry out single-digit addition by the end of the IEP reporting period. And that's the objective, right? Let's say with 85% or greater accuracy on the last 5 assessment trials. Okay, so I've got something now that is both specific to the instruction. This is what I'm going to be doing, right? I'm going to be working on single-digit addition, but I'm also going to be working on assessment, right? So I need to be scoring how she's doing. So that objective, although clear potentially, doesn't give me the methodology for actually how I'm going to assess the material. And so what I want to be able to do is say, I'm going to be giving 10 single-digit problems in a session, right? And I'm going to be scoring the accuracy of whether she gets it right or wrong independently without any kind of level of support. Okay, so I hand it to her. Now, is it timed or is it not timed, right? So that's part of both the instruction and the assessment. If it's timed, how much time am I giving her? So as you can see here, I'm layering in different levels of information with respect to the methodology that in some cases often don't actually go into an IEP. In certain states, the IEPs per se don't have details of the methodology. They just simply describe kind of what the performance is going to be, let's say, for the objectives benchmark. Okay, so that's kind of an academic objective or goal. What about social emotional? What if I've got a social emotional goal where I'm focusing on level of engagement or time on learning or time on task, right? So in each of these cases, I want to be describing kind of what I'm looking for when I'm assessing, let's say, time on task. Okay, so I give some task, right? And I'm assessing how much time they spend on the task. Well, what does that mean to spend time on a task? Does the student have to be actively writing and or reading, right? What are they doing? Does that have to be continuous, right? So if they get up and take a break, does that break my timer, right? So that's about assessment, and I want to be clear for those who are assessing, but also during instruction, what am I doing to engage the child in time on task? Am I prompting them? Am I giving them tips? Am I saying, hey, great job, I like how you're filling out the answers here? Am I giving them feedback? Those are all part of both instruction, but they weigh into assessment, right? So just to sort of capture that a little more clearly, if I have a time on task objective where I'm looking for how much time the child is either writing or reading or engaged with the material given, I want to be clear, does that include feedback? If it does, that's part of my methodology. If it's no feedback, then the instructor involved with the student needs to keep the feedback out so that I can get a clean assessment of what's going on during that time. Okay? And then lastly, just as a kind of a final possible example, just to give a sense of the space here, is if I've got a task analysis, let's say on some kind of functional objective like brushing teeth, right? I've got the steps in a sequence of what I expect the child to do. So grab the tube of toothpaste, grab the toothbrush, uncap the toothpaste, put toothpaste onto the toothbrush, and so forth. Okay, so those are the steps of my task. Now, what I'm both potentially modeling for the child and assessing are those steps and whether I'm giving support at each level of that analysis, right? That task analysis, or each step of the task analysis. Okay, so if my scoring method is whether they did it or didn't do it in the order in which it's supposed to be done, but without support, meaning independently, then both my instruction and my assessment has to be independent success on each step of that task analysis. Okay, and I want to write that out so that when different staff are assessing or involved in the instruction and potentially modeling, that it's clear what they should or shouldn't do. Now, one of the things that's become clear in the last slide in terms of the mechanics piece is that there's a key component of methods which has to which is in terms of defining one's terms. And here it's critical that when one spells out the IEP objective, one needs to give some examples of the kinds of ideas one has in mind when we're using certain kinds of terms. Now again, that may be spelled out in more detail in the methodological section than in the IEP proper, but it's clear to be very clear about what one means by certain kinds of terms. So let me give an example just to illustrate. So let's say the IEP objective is this a child who, let's say, has a hard time sitting still, and one of the things that we're working on is the ability for Dan to stay seated in his chair during class. Okay. Now that seems very straightforward. So I'm scoring either was he seated on his seat or wasn't he. But if there's differences in perception about what we expect in terms of being seated in the chair, and staff perceive that differently, then the assessment will be differently, and so too will be the instruction, right? So if Mr. Jones says seated in seat means butt on the chair seat and both feet planted on the floor, that's what he counts, right? Whereas Mrs. Smith says, look, as long as his butt's on the seat, I don't care if his legs are both crossed together and he's got one up and one down, as long as his butt's. Well, that kind of variation means that Mrs. Smith is scoring it one way and Mr. Jones is scoring it in a different way. And that's going to lend variation to the score, but it will also lend variation to the instruction, right? For Mr. Jones, if Dan has got his feet off the ground, he's going to have some instructional moments to say, look, Dan, I want both of your feet on the floor. Okay, Mrs. Smith's like, yeah, okay, I don't care, right? So you've got that variation between staff. That's going to add variation onto the methodology. That's going to add variation onto both assessment and instruction. A second example here is for kind of a motor type of IEP objective or goal. So maybe a child with certain kind of physical disability. So Sam will independently walk to a target location and pick up an object in 4 out of 5 assessments. Now here we've got some places where we could imagine some variability. Okay, so first of all, independent, right? So obviously clearly here, no kind of support, physical, verbal, gestural, and so forth. And Sam is going from one spot, right, to another spot, and is going to pick up an object. But note here that what's unspecified in the IEP, but should be specified in the methodology, is over what kind of distance is Sam walking, over what kind of terrain, and what kind of object or objects is he meant to pick up. Now, if that's just free to vary, you could imagine one person says, okay, Sam, here we are. We're standing right here at the head of our classroom, and you're going to walk to the cafeteria, maybe 100 feet away. But, Susie, a para, says, no, we're just going to walk from this part of the classroom to the other side of the classroom, and that's going to be it. And maybe another person says, yeah, and occasionally we're going to walk upstairs. Those are very different demands in terms of movement, especially independently for a child with disabilities. And that needs to be clarified, because if one wants a range of variation of both distance and maybe topography, right, that they're walking over, that could be very important for generalization, but one would want to be clear on that was what the objective was testing. Okay. In the same way, the size, shape, texture, and weight of the object could have a great effect on how readily the child picks it up. So he's now standing, Sam grabs the object. If it's a one-handed thing that's small, perhaps really easy to pick up. If it's kind of large and bulky and heavy, maybe he has a hard time stabilizing with both hands. So again, the methodology should have a description of the range of variation in an object, because that will affect the assessment and it will affect how we understand generalization. Let's take another example from the social emotional domain. So here we have an objective. When dysregulated, Sarah will self-advocate when frustrated in 4 out of 5 observations so that she can become regulated. So here we have several things that need to be spelled out. So first is, this is an objective which is triggered by the observation of dysregulation. What does that look like for Sarah, right? So again, you might want to have in your objective and in parentheses, for example, shuts down or bangs the desk or whatever it looks like to be dysregulated for Sarah. Okay, so once I see those behaviors, then I look for Sarah's ability to self-advocate it because she's frustrated, right? What does self-advocate look like? Ask for help, raise hands, specifically say, I need help to a teacher, right? So what does self-advocate look like so that I can assess it and both use that opportunity for instruction, okay? And then lastly, the self-advocation is meant to help with the regulation, so I also need to see what regulation looks like for Sarah. The last piece, and I'm going to use this one just in part because it's so often used in IEP objectives, is focused on time on learning. And so here, Tim will increase his time on learning to 80% or more when working on an ELA assignment in class. Okay, so clearly this is an objective where we've got sort of current performance baseline information, whatever that may be, and we're going to increase it to 80% or more by the end of the IEP reporting period, let's say, based on ELA assignments. Okay, so first of all, I need to spell out what time on learning looks like, right? So what is Tim doing such that I can say, yep, time on learning versus time off learning, right? So time on learning is actively working on something, reading, right? Sort of at least focused on the material, right? And what does that look like? Okay, time off learning is maybe getting up out of his seat, being dysregulated, talking to his friends, right? Those are all things that would be time off learning. Okay, so once that's spelled out, then I've got the second piece, which is working on an ELA assignment. Okay, so what kind of ELA assignment, right? That might affect time on learning. Let's say Tim loves to read, so when he's given a book to read, he's all in, 100% of time on learning, right? he doesn't like to write. So when he's on a writing assignment, his time on learning goes way down. Okay, so we want to spell out what kinds of assignments we're giving, and it could be a whole variety of them, but we want to be able to assess then how does time on learning get affected by the type of ELA assignment. Okay, the next topic is kind of the how and the when of basically assessment and instruction. And what I want to start out with is that for many types of both assessment and instruction, just the spacing between teacher and student, or parent student, or clinician and student may have an effect on both their performance, their readiness and willingness to learn, but it could also directly affect the assessment piece, right? Some students might need a bit of space, right, when you're assessing or instructing them, because maybe they want some distance between you and them so they can see you clearly, right? Or maybe if you're too close, they find that intimidating, they kind of shut down, right? So one wants to think about the spacing, not only because it may help optimize or maximize instruction, but because once that's decided upon, that's part of your methodology, right? So if I'm doing something like discrete trials, and I'm handing a child some kind of thing to act on, right? My distance is a part of that methodology, right? And if I'm having other people who are working with me in a classroom do it with that child, I need to share that information. So the separation, right, and the relative location of you in relationship to the child can have an effect on instruction and on assessment. Another piece of this is kind of the timing of material and kind of how it's presented, right? So let's imagine that we're doing something which is maybe a choice task, right? Where we're given 2 or 3 options, right? Where one is correct and the other 2, let's say, are incorrect, right? And let's say we're presenting it on a choice board, right? Do we present it, vertically like this or horizontally like this? Do we put it in front of them before they choose? So we show it to them and then we slide it forward. What's the separation between the elements that in some cases may be affected by a child with visual acuity issues, where we've got to pull them in closer? And then the question is, can they see them equally? Are they attracted by one earlier than the other? Are we kind of counterbalancing right versus left side, or up or down? So all of those decisions are critical to the methodology, and they must be mapped out and described if we're going to get both accurate assessment information and if our instruction is going to be effective in terms of impacting learning and decision making. Okay, so that's about the how, the where, and the timing of the material presented. Something else that can greatly affect performance and therefore, of course, assessment is time of day. Now, we may not always have the ability to control time of day, but it's important, even if we don't, to be able to be cognizant of when we're testing a child, right? So if we're testing them or instructing them, we need to be aware of time of day, because of course it could affect performance. Some kids come in and they're bright and alert early on in the day and then fade as the day goes on. Or some children come in very dysregulated, let's say when they get off the bus, because the bus itself is disruptive. So if we can kind of both accommodate for time of day, or at least take it into account, that will affect both our assessment and our instructional strategies. Another thing that I like to discuss with teachers, people in related services, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, clinicians, is that when information is being taught, something is being taught, especially new material, it's important that the child gives the educator information back that tells you that they're ready, or what I like to call the green light condition, right? So regardless of the kind of student and the kind of disability that he or she may have, you want them to show you that they're ready by doing something that you know they know, okay? So if it's a child with emotional disabilities and you're working on their ability to kind of use new coping skills that you're giving them, you want to do something that says, I'm ready, okay? It could be, hey, high five, right? And they respond to you. It could be, you know, say your name, in a funny way, right? Something that's going to engage them, but it shows they're responsive to you. If it's a child who's perhaps using assistive technology, and you know from prior work that they know the icons or symbols for yes and no, you might give them a series of questions that the answers are clearly yes or no, and you know they should know that, and therefore they should be able to use the yes and no. Like, student's name is James, and you say, your name is Fred. No, right? You're wearing a hat. No, right? It's raining out, and you say, it's raining out. Yes. Okay, so you give them a series of questions where you're confident that they know the answer and they can use yes and no appropriately. And insofar as they do, that gives you that green light condition for going forward with the new material. Something else that can affect individuals' performance, and therefore both the instruction and the assessment piece, are possibly monthly cycles. Maybe there are events that happen each month or during certain months that are cause anxiety or worries or distract them or make them shut down or whatever it is. Or there are months of the year because of things like holidays that cause things to be more difficult for a child. Again, these are not often things that we can control for, but being aware of them might affect how one does assessments and how one moves into new kinds of instructional material. Okay, so again, it's just like time of day, one might not have control over them, but being aware of them and making sure that our data are associated with those times of day or months or cycles can help us with the interpretation of our data when we get variation because of those things. Lastly, and sort of very similarly to time of day and monthly cycles and holidays, is being aware of days and schedules, including weekends, that can affect, again, performance and therefore our assessment and our instruction. So a child, for example, who lives Monday through Friday with mom and then on the weekends goes home to dad, it may be a wonderful experience in both cases, but just because there's a transition, the child may start showing anxiety coming out of the weekend into the first day of the week on Monday, or in parallel may show a difficulty on Friday going into the weekend. There may also be certain days of the week where there are, let's say, extra related services and the child either likes them or doesn't like them, and that could affect transitions from one activity to another. So these are all things that can affect, again, how we assess children and how we instruct them. Another aspect which is important to both the kinds of assessments we make in our methodology as well as the methodology for instruction is who's doing it. And again, here, some cases we have control over this, in some cases we don't. And in some cases we may actually be interested in how well a child generalizes across different staff. For example, it's certainly not uncommon that a child, let's say with emotional disabilities, builds up some kind of trust with a teacher, which is fantastic because maybe they were not learning very well at all in a prior environment. But once they establish that trust and relationship, now all of a sudden they start to really do well in terms of behavioral management and learning and all these other things, right? But ultimately, that person, let's call it, Mr. John, Mr. John is not going to be the teacher for life, no matter how great he is, and so that child needs to generalize. So we need to think about the kinds of things that can affect generalization, and the things that can actually potentially cause some stagnation or some backtracking on children. So for example, if Mr. John has been the primary teacher, and now there's a new teacher, and she happens to be of a different, gender, right? That might affect some children, right? Just simply a gender switch. Maybe equally capable, may have lots and lots of experiences, maybe super, super nice and engaged, but just the male-female difference for some children may make a difference due to their prior history or anything that could affect their attraction towards women versus men. Okay, so gender is something to consider. Familiarity. I know you, I don't know you. If I don't know you, I'm out, right? So for some kids, that's just going to be it'll stop right there. Familiarity will cause potentially some challenges for some children. Familiarity, of course, is related to other things, which is the relationship piece and the trust piece. For many children, the learning really begins to pick up speed, right, when they form relationships with staff and when they begin to build that trust because of the expectation, the predictability. For children who live maybe in disruptive types of chaotic environments, the stability and predictability of staff can really, really trigger a positive move towards learning, whether it's social, emotional, academic, or both, okay? So we need to consider these things because they greatly affect the methodology of how we're assessing and instructing. A child may shut down in the face of one type of staff member and turn on in the face of the other, not because of how it's being done, but just because of the individual and their relationship to that individual. Lastly, and this is particularly important for children with trauma, is that certain individuals will remind them of individuals who may have been physically or sexually abusive to them in their past, right? Or neglectful of them, right? So that guy reminds me of the father who never really paid attention to me, and so as a result of that, I'm just shutting down and I'm not doing anything, right? So again, this is sort of the more of the negative side that can happen, and again, we may not have any control over the individuals who are interacting with that child because of the limited staff we have. But being aware of how staff specifically can affect differences in performance, and therefore our assessments, needs to play a role in how we take data on children, whatever the kind of data it is. So all of these factors in terms of the who of our methodology are important because they will ultimately affect our consistency, right? So if it's the same individual and only one individual doing both the assessment and the instruction, then the only thing that can affect consistency is internal to that individual. Insofar as both assessment and instruction are being done by multiple individuals, let's say with the same material, then we have issues that have to do with inter-staff consistency. Okay. Now, that brings up ways in which we might think about the consistency issue. And here we have a couple of things that weigh into the consistency or the validity of many assessment tools. In some cases, you'll have something like, a survey, okay, which has been, let's say, very well validated by some, group of scientists that have published on this. They've run thousands of subjects on the tool, and they know it gives you valid, reliable, predictable information that you care about. Let's say something on social emotional measures having to do with empathy and problem solving and emotion management and self-advocacy, right? And there's this very nice survey, and you can administer it. Maybe the student takes the survey, maybe teachers also take it, evaluating the child. Now, if we have a survey tool, even though the tool itself has been well validated, the individuals, let's say staff-wise, who are filling it out may not be consistently doing it or doing it in the same way as a group. And so, for example, let's say that we've got a tool which gives us a survey on social emotional kind of capacities, abilities, right? So empathy, emotion management, problem solving, and so forth. And we have one staff member who's been in the school, let's say a teacher, for 10 years, and this child has been in her classroom for the last 2 years and knows the child really, really well, right? Seen this child in all sorts of different arenas. And then a second staff member, a school psychologist, is also going to assess that child with the same tool, but has only seen the child for a couple of weeks. Well, the input of the evaluation is just going to be very, very different because one individual, the teacher, has 2 years of experience with this child, and the school psychologist only has a couple of weeks. So that can affect the outcome measure, and therefore the reliability between the staff is very, very different, right? They may be using a very valid tool, but they're using it in different ways, okay, just based on the experience of that child. So we need to consider the ways in which different staff taking the same information can be consistent or inconsistent with each other. And one nice thing to do when you're doing assessments of children, let's say that are not a survey, like just watching, was so-and-so aggressive, were there self-injuries, was the child shut down, is that whatever your rubric or scale of measurement is, that in the early phases, consult with each other. Say, oh, I gave that a 3 out of 5. Oh, I gave that a 4 out of 5. Why'd you give it a 3? Why'd you give it a 4? You discuss it and you refine. And if you iterate that kind of conversation multiple times, eventually you'll start converging on your assessments, and now you can start doing them independently. Okay. Another arena, but much more specific in terms of methodology, is how we use our methods to basically deliver and assess level and frequency and or intensity of support. So support plays a really critical role, obviously, in special education, because what it does is it solves what I call the gap problem, right? The gap problem is we've got the demands from the school, right? The environmental demands that a school puts on a student, and we've got the personal competency of the child coming into that school, okay? So often, especially in special education, there's a mismatch between what the school demands on the one hand and what the child's competencies are on the other, okay? And what supports do is they help bring that gap closer and closer and closer so the child's competencies can really tackle the demands of the environment, grow, learn, make healthy decisions. So what kind and for what are the supports for? Well, one way of thinking about this, one way that's been captured by a lot of educators, is you can think of competency as falling into 5 sort of zones or 5 different domains that everyone has, right? And they have them in greater or lesser extents, okay? So we each have our own physical competencies, we have our own conceptual competencies, we have practical competencies, problem solving. We have social competencies, getting along with others, right, and managing ourselves. And emotional competencies, regulating different emotions, expressing emotions, and so forth, okay? So the question is, if we are evaluating each of these domains, in what areas does a child have a gap between what he or she is capable of doing and what the school demands? Okay, that's where support comes in. So when we are supporting a child, and there's all sorts of types of support we may give them, as well as kind of frequency and intensity of those supports. So we might have full physical, where a child has to be, taken by, let's say, a hand, and their hand has to be brought to the tube of toothpaste and then to the toothbrush, and we have to help them kind of coordinate that action, right? So that's kind of full physical. We might just have a visual cue, right? Some kind of visual cue that the graphic organizer or some kind of schedule, right, which is visual, verbal, gestural, modeling, partial physical, and so forth, right? So there are different kinds of support that we may give depending on the child, depending on the disability, depending on what we're trying to achieve in the moment. Okay, so one aspect is, well, how often are we doing these things, right? So it's not only the type, but how often. So let's say we're talking about, verbal redirections, right? So child swears. Okay, Sally, please no swearing in the school. Sally swears again, please don't swear in the school. We can repeat it, right? So how often are we doing it is one kind of support, and we need to be recording the frequency of the support and the kind of support, right? We also want to be careful, however, how we're delivering it, right? So it's often the case, so we just write down, okay, that was a gestural support, that was modeling, that was verbal, that was partial physical. But how, right? So I point to the tube of toothpaste. Okay, that seems very straightforward. That's a gestural support, right? So I pointed to something. But how do I do it? Do I grab the child's attention first, and once I'm sure I've got it, then I point, right? That's a very specific methodology. Grab the child's attention and then point to make sure they're following you, okay? Same with verbal. Am I making sure that I've got eye contact with the child when I say, please, no swearing, right? Okay? What's the tone of my voice? What am I actually saying? All that needs to be described methodologically so that the kind of support and how it's delivered is clear to anybody who's giving support to that child so that we can be consistent. Sampling. It's important that when we start thinking about our methodologies for collecting data on the assessment piece or giving instruction, that we map out how we're going to do it in terms of sampling the space of information we need. Okay, so one question is, who's doing the assessment, right? When and by whom? All right, so let's imagine a schedule, right? So we want to understand who's assessed, when, and by whom. So now I've got a little calendar, right? This will say it's a part of my day. I've got days of the week. I've got, context, morning meeting, ELA, lunch, and math. And then in each kind of cell, right? So context by day of the week, I'm mapping out which students are being assessed, on what, and in parentheses, by whom. Those are the staff members in the classroom. So you can see here, I've started morning meeting. We're going to start first on Monday with John and Sarah. That's going to be our little group, and that little group will be taken by staff TD, right? Then on Tuesday, I've got Billy, Jacob, and Joe, staff SA. And then on Thursday, Tim and Karen and JF. Okay, so I'm basically mapping out the schedule, and there's a couple of reasons for this. I want to be able to be sure that given the things they need to both assess and instruct, that the students are getting a relatively equitable allocation, right? So that I want to make sure everybody hits morning meeting, everybody hits ELA, everybody hits lunch, everybody hits math, and I want them to be on different days of the week, potentially with different clusterings of students, and potentially with different clusterings of staff. Why? Because some of the measures I'm kind of focused on, let's say social emotional measures, or certain things having to do with task analyses, or things with academic capacity, if I care about how things like day of the week, staff, and context affect performance, I want to be sure that I'm giving them an opportunity to see how well they generalize in different situations, which include time of day, day of the week, who they're with, who they're being taught by, right? Who they're being assessed by. Okay, that's very important, because a very common question that I often get is, well, what's enough sampling, right? So how many, in a benchmark of X out of Y, 3 out of 5 cases they'll do something, whatever that something may be. People seem to be looking for kind of, the magic answer. Well, it's 6, 6. If you can do 6, that's good. The challenge here is there is no magic number, right? Because what counts as sufficient sampling depends to a large extent on what we're measuring and the factors that could influence variability in performance, and the extent to which we're trying to get at the generalization piece. Okay, so let's say we're looking at math ability. Let's say, order of operations. Okay, so we're looking at order of operations, or we're looking at, an ELA's thing, which is, correct punctuation. Those are the kinds of skills that once a child has them, we don't really expect things like, okay, if they're doing it one-on-one, or if they're doing it in a group, or they're doing it on Monday or Friday, they should have really minimal impact on the ability to express that, right? If you know order of operations, or grammatical punctuation, we don't expect there to be a lot of variation in performance. Now, if a kid's clearly always exhausted early in the morning, that might not be the time to instruct or assess if one has that flexibility, right? But we're not looking for generalization across context as much as if we're looking at social emotional objectives, or motor types of objectives where context could have a great effect, right? So let's say we're looking at a child's ability to use whole body listening, or we're looking at a child's ability to participate in a conversation or to self-regulate. Okay, we know in the area, for example, self-regulation, that a lot of things are going to affect anyone's ability for self-regulation. Are we hungry? Are we tired? Is we frustrated by who's around us? Are we annoyed by a certain staff member more than another staff member? So there, if we want to say that a child has hit her objective of being able to self-regulate, right? We want to be confident that that's not just on Monday at 9 in the morning, but in a whole bunch of different contexts. So here you can see, as a kind of a rule of thumb, the more things that can affect performance the larger the sample we need to accommodate the things that can affect performance. Okay, the narrower the range of things that can affect performance, which can be based on our own personal experience or can be based on standardized testing, then we need fewer samples to be confident we have a sense of their performance abilities. Another topic that really weighs into methodology, and this goes back to the issue of consistency, are things that can basically bias in particular directions, which might not give us a clear assessment of what's going on, and may also affect how we teach. Okay, so I want to lay out for you some of the reasons that biases can play a kind of a nasty role, right, in both assessment and instruction, and then just to get you thinking about this so that you can be at least aware of these. The things that can affect us in terms of biases are we get kind of overwhelmed by too much information, so we just go with something, right? It's just overwhelmed. We don't have enough time to kind of parse through all the issues and really weigh out pros and cons. We're overloaded in our memory, right? Too much going on, so I can't think straight, so I just go with something. Or whatever it is just doesn't have much meaning for us, right? So we're just biased against it from the beginning, like, this is dumb, I don't want to do that, right? I don't like teaching this, and so this shares no meaning, right? Some regulation from the state, you have to do this, and like, why? This makes no sense, right? Okay, so these are things that can cause biases, and I want to just give you three. There are many types of bias. These are three that I think really play quite often out in education, and being aware of them can help us be better educators. So one's called the anchoring bias. And this is where, in some sense, the first piece of information we get, right, the initial information, really anchors us, right, provides a foundation for subsequent assessments or decisions. Okay. So let me give a kind of a couple examples from sort of psychology, behavioral economics, where these things were basically developed, is imagine I ask you to write down the last two digits of your social security number. Okay, so mine's 88. So I write down 88, and let's say you write yours down and you write down 12. Okay, now I show you a bottle of wine. I say, this is a very good bottle of wine, and if you were to be bidding on this bottle of wine, how much would you pay? Okay, and so you write down, your value. Well, what it turns out is that if you do this in a large crowd, right, a large audience, what you find is that the higher the number of the person's last two digits of Social Security is, the higher you bid on that bottle. So I, with 88, would say, oh, $60, $80, right, $90, right? You, with 12, would say, 15, 20, 8, You would anchor the value down because your numbers in your Social Security number are lower. Now, of course, that's ridiculous. Your Social Security number has nothing to do with how much you would value a good bottle of wine. But that first piece of information, the number on your Social Security, completely random and irrelevant, biases your decision making. Okay, so that's one thing. Well, why relevant to education? Because we get new students who come in, right? And first impressions can have an incredible effect on how we think about them, often pigeonholing them maybe. Right? Or we read, the transcript, right? And information, we go, oh boy, given what happened in last school, we read like, oh boy, suspended 3 times. Like, oh no, here we go. This is going to be really bad, right? This is going to be really hard. Or the opposite, right? Kids come in, and often in the first week in a new school, there's kind of a honeymoon phase, right? Where they're all good, and all the things that were in the transcript, like, I don't even see any of this. And then you think, okay, I'm good, right? And all of a sudden, something happens and it changes, right? But we anchor to that early perception, and that can be very dangerous because we pigeonhole things, right? We close off possible alternative ways of thinking about it. A second type of bias is an outcome bias, where we're kind of focused on the outcome rather than kind of on the potential causes that kind of led to that. So here's Superman, right? Look, thanks for the ride. It seems that jumping off was a great idea after all. Well, no, jumping off a building is not a great idea, right? Yes, it was great that he saved you, which is the outcome, right? But that's not what's driving the situation, right? So we want to be careful that we're not just focused on the outcome, but we're trying to peel back and look at some of the causes that have led to that, rather than making assumptions about some relationship between what happened and what happened maybe just before. Okay, and then lastly is what's called the confirmation bias. And here, what's happening is we have some thought, some idea, some intuition, some explanation, right, about what's going on with the child or anybody. And now we're just looking for evidence that confirms that view, right? So, let's say I've got, an ache in my rib, right, and it really hurts. And I go to the first doctor and I say, doctor, my ribs are just really hurting. And he says, okay, we'll run some, x-rays. And he's like, I just don't see anything. He goes, so you leave and you say, yeah, terrible doctor. Go to the next doctor. Same thing, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't see anything. Go to the third doctor and he goes, oh, yeah. This looks like an early form of kind of arthritis maybe. You got a little bit of swelling there. And he gives me medicine. Like, now that's a doctor, right? I knew there was something going on. So you're basically looking for evidence to confirm whatever ideas you have. This obviously has great potentially harm in the area of education. And I'll just give an example from a personal experience. Right? I was going to visit a school where we had developed some data collection tools for them, looking at sort of timeouts and sort of restraints and suspensions, and we were going in to kind of look at the data for the first time after a few months of data collection. So I called the director and I said, is it still okay for us to have our meeting tomorrow at 2:00? And he goes, yeah, it's fine. He goes, but Wednesdays are just the worst day in the school, so I just the staff may be a little bit out of sorts and they may be a little distracted because the days are often very difficult. I said, that's fine. I said, well, we'll get something done, I'm sure. So before I went out on that Wednesday, on Tuesday, I actually looked at the data and I plotted the frequency of timeouts and restraints and suspensions by day of the week. Well, Wednesdays was not the day, right? Actually, the day that was the highest was Tuesday. Now, if your perception is Wednesday is the worst day, that can actually cause you to basically believe that, okay, that's the worst day. And so now all of a sudden you're looking for evidence. Oh, see, I had a restraint today. It was Wednesday. Therefore, Wednesday's the worst day. So it starts confirming, right, that bias. So we want to be careful of that because that can tremendously affect how we interact with students and often in a negative way. We should be looking for evidence that maybe confirms our intuitions, explanations, or thoughts, but also rejects it, right? So we should be looking broadly, not just for things that support our interpretation of what's going on. Another important topic, which actually links up to the bias piece, is that we want ways in which we can check for errors, right? And errors can come in a lot of ways. One way in which errors can come in is just simply our methodology of how we're doing something. And one thing that can be very helpful is have multiple staff that are maybe working in a classroom check each other, right? So again, imagine that we're on this task analysis where we model for a child how they take toothpaste, toothbrush, put toothpaste on, and so forth, right? And so a paraprofessional working with me, the teacher, is about to go model. She goes and models, right? And she grabs the toothbrush, puts it down, then grabs the toothpaste, undoes the cap, right, squeezes it on, and continues. And I say, wait a minute, the order was grab the toothpaste, put it down, grab the toothbrush, put it down, pick up the toothpaste, uncap it, right, put the cap down, and then grab the toothbrush and squeeze it. So I'm correcting her for an error of sequencing, which of course is critical because if we are inconsistent in how we model for the child's going to be completely confused. Okay, so that's checking each other for inconsistencies or errors in methodology, right, that can affect both instruction and performance. Another important thing is that we find time to regularly review our data to sort of potentially catch errors that may be just simply data entry errors, right? So I look at a pattern and I go, whoa, what's that, dot over here where I have the red arrow? That looks bizarre. I don't remember the child ever showing that level of performance, on this point in time. As you can see from the chart, the data points are kind of growing and, in this case, getting better, right? So if time is on the x-axis or horizontal and performance is on the y or vertical axis, the child's getting better over time. So what's that dot there, right? Did they really do that badly? So maybe we check and go, actually, that's an error. I meant to put in, 90, not 9. Okay, so reviewing the data can help us catch for errors. Now, one thing that can help with errors, especially in terms of data entry, is using what's often called data validation. And these are ways in which a data system, especially a digital data system, can constrain what's getting entered. And I want to just use an example from Google Sheet. The same thing can be done with Excel or any spreadsheet. So in Google Sheet, there's a little interface called data validation where you can sort of look at the criteria here where it says list of items. And let's say you're entering into a cell, something having to do with attendance, right? So the child's either present, absent, arrive early, or arrive late, okay? Now, you could just type those in. I mean, in fact, that would be fine. That's what most people would do, right? They would just type in present, absent, arrive early, or P, A, AE, or AL. However you want to do it, you'd have those entries. Now, the problem with doing that is that if I'm typing, there's a probability of me making an error, and I want to reduce those. Data validation, where you have a criteria of list of items, allows you to have those entries spelled out, and now inside the cell is a drop-down menu where you can pick those words, and now there's no more typing. So that will minimize errors due to typing errors. Another way of using data validation is to have the criteria set to numbers. Let's say I'm entering numbers into a cell, and let's say it's a percentage. So it's a percentage score on a quiz or a test or whatever it may be. If it's a percentage, the variation is between 0 and 100. So now I say any cell within this column, which is a percentage score, right, can only be between 0 to 100. I select reject input if it's outside that range and show a little text help menu pop up. So now if I type in 1000 and hit return, it will reject it and will say only values between 0 and 100. Okay, so that will limit any errors of entry outside 0 and 100. Needless to say, if I type 90 and I meant to hit 9, there will be no rejection because it can't distinguish within that bounds. So data validation can minimize our errors by restricting the range of options I get, and therefore can help with errors. So let me sum up today's Module 2 on the art of consistency by sort of picking up on the highlights. The first is that good methods are like how-to manuals. They describe in detail what you should do. And what that means is that anybody kind of walking off the street should be able to pick up that how-to manual and do what you want them to do, consistently, reliably, right? So it's clear in its description. Secondly is being thoughtful in your methodologies about how you're presenting something, when you're presenting something, and who. So the spacing between teacher and student, the orientation of the material that you're presenting, having those green light conditions where you are setting them up, starting them off, kind of a warm-up with material that they know, and if they get it right, that gives you that green light to move on to the harder stuff, right? And then thinking about inter-staff differences, both in terms of consistency, but in the case of children with trauma, that a staff may be a trigger, and that may undermine the relationship that is required in many cases for effective teaching. Biases and errors, to be aware of things like the anchor bias, the outcome bias, and the confirmation bias, so that you are not going to be able to get rid of those because they're part of human nature, all human nature, but being aware of them will let you say, okay, wait, I just keep looking for evidence that's supporting this idea. I'm not looking for evidence that's rejecting it. I need to do that too, right? Getting individuals who are working with you to check you for your methods and look for possible errors, both in how you're doing something and in terms of data entry. And then lastly, planning out your schedule of collecting information and instruction so that you make sure that you're sampling kids in a variety of different situations so that if it's some measure, like the social emotional measures that can show variability, that you're taking that into account and sampling sufficiently that you can get a sense of what their variability looks like. So that's it for today. I hope this has been a useful kind of introduction to some of the key ideas involved in collecting data and that it will help you master the art of consistency.